Today we're going to install an instance of Debian to be used in our class. This install can be applied to the Linux and Python course taught in the information security program at Red River College. It can also be used in the ethical hacking and pen testing course, as well as the web server security course. So it can be used in a number of different courses. You may be seeing it in one of those courses. I may be using it in other instances as well. But today we're just going to focus on setting up a secure version of Debian. As I've mentioned in my lectures, if you're going to set up a secure version of any operating system, one of the things you want to ensure you do is not add unnecessary software. Any extra software installed in a system is going to introduce a potential vulnerability in the future. Not all, of course. It's unlikely that every single bit of software is at some point going to be a vulnerability in your system. However, you should always be risk critical in everything that you do with your computer systems. If I add this, will it possibly introduce a vulnerability in the future? The answer is it might, and with that mindset, you really have to be careful of what you install. With that, we're going to go and set up Debian today. I've already downloaded the installer ISO. For this one, it's Debian 12.1 for the 64-bit version of PC operating systems. I have one of the more recent versions of VirtualBox installed, version 7. It might not be the version you have, but the process should be pretty similar. I have groups that I use in VirtualBox just because I use it so much. So the fact that I have different groups here is for organization purposes. You may or may not need this, but I am going to create a new instance of Debian for my web server security class in this case. So I will click on new. I can also go machine new, or I can do Control N. And I like to give it a descriptive name. If I'm installing Debian, I like to start by typing in Debian. As soon as I get to the B in Debian, it says you probably want to install a 64-bit version of Debian Linux, which is exactly what I want. Again, I get to give it a descriptive name, and I need to specify the ISO image that I had downloaded before. Alright, so click on that. Navigate through your file system to wherever you have your ISO downloaded and add that to your virtual machine. Now, I am going to skip the unintended installation. Again, risk critical analysis. I want to know exactly what I'm installing, so I am going to manually select and install what I want on this machine. So give it a name, specify the ISO that you're going to use for the installer, skip the unattended installation, next. The defaults are probably fine here for what we need to do. Of course, your use case may be different, but 2 gig of RAM, 1 core for my processor should be fine. Click on next. 20 gig is more than enough for what we needed to do. We're not going to pre-allocate the disk size, so it'll be dynamically allocated. It will grow as needed. It's not going to be a full 20 gig file on our operating system's file system. So it will grow as necessary, and that too is fine. So the defaults are fine for the hard disk option. I have to say the wizard for VirtualBox does make this process quite a bit easier. At the end, this should be fine. I will click on finish and make any changes I need post configuration wizard. Now you can click on any of these words and go into the settings area directly. For example, if I want to modify the network, I can just click on the word network and will open up the network dialog box. I can also click on settings and go along the side and select what I wish to change. The general should be fine. The system should be fine. You don't need to make any changes here. You can give yourself another core if you want to. I don't think that's necessary for the kind of work we're going to typically do. If you do want to get into some password cracking, you might benefit by adding a couple of cores and giving yourself a little bit more memory for the pen testing activities, but the defaults are probably fine. Display is fine for a terminal environment. If we were going to do a GUI, we might give ourselves a little bit more RAM just to give us a little bit more features. Storage is fine, but this is where you would add the ISO if you had not already selected it. Audio, we don't really need. We could probably turn that off given how little we use it. I'm going to leave it as is. The network, we are definitely going to make a change because in my classes at Red River College Polytechnic, we use two different network connections. We have a cloud-facing NAT adapter, and then to isolate our network traffic, we have a separate network. So a lot of the machines are going to be on both the internet and on this host-only network, and some of our target machines for pen testing and for malware analysis are going to be on a host-only network. All right. We're going to enable that adapter, and we are going to select the host-only network, VirtualBox host-only network, and we are going to change our promiscuous mode to allow all, and click on OK. If that doesn't work, then you go into Tools, Network Manager. And this will bring up the host network manager. If there is no host network here, you can click on create and make sure that all of the addresses make sense. You should probably only have one. There is one possible class or lab that I do where we do need two internal networks. It's for one of the pen testing activities. We rarely get to that in our time allocated, but there is a rare exception where we might add a second host-only network, but by and large, one host network. Make sure that the IPs make sense. Your network has an address, in my case, and in most cases it's 56.1. Doesn't have to be, but most cases it is. Regardless of what that is, the adapter needs to be the same as the DHCP server's addresses, and you probably want to give the server the address of 100, so you've got some static IPs you can use as well as a pool of dynamic addresses. So I tend to use 100 for the server address and a range of 101 to 254 for the pool of DHCP or dynamic addresses. But regardless, 56, 56, 56, and 56. They all need to be the same. If you're struggling with this, reach out to your instructor. Okay. So I've got my Debian server here. I've got it configured for my two network adapters here and here. I can now start my virtual machine and start the installation. On this, first off, you only have 30 seconds, so I'll talk quickly. This is an installation interface. This is the bootloader for this ISO that we downloaded. So basically it's trying to launch an operating system. This operating system does one thing, and that is install the operating system. We are going to use the graphical install even though we're not going to install the graphical tool set. So hit enter or wait for the 30 seconds to expire. At this point, it will load an instance of Debian that will bring up this graphical installer, which will allow us to do a point-and-click installation of Debian. And the language we are going to use is English. Continue. I've talked about language packs. Generally, you have fewer technical or configuration problems if you use the language pack that matches the language of the tools you are using. In this case, we're using English tools, so we'll use the default English language. You have the United States. You could say you're in the United States, but we are in Canada. It does help a little bit with localization settings and time zone options and where to find install media on the internet, so it does help to specify Canada. I did this by hitting the C on my keyboard, which took me to Canada. So I can click on Continue. It wants to know the keyboard American English is fine. It then goes through, starts loading a bunch of information, and starts the process of determining how you're going to set up Linux. One of the first things we're going to configure is our network. Now, because we have two network adapters here, we have to say which adapter are we going to use to connect to the internet. One is on NAT, one is on our internal host-only network, so we want to use the one that's NAT, Network Address Translation, one that is visible to the internet. And that's going to be our first adapter here. So we're going to select ENP0S3 and continue. It wants a host name at this point. This is still part of the initial machine setup. It hasn't really installed anything yet. I like to give my host names very short names, and I'll explain why towards the end of this video. I'm just going to call it DEB. You can call it whatever you want, but by keeping it short, you are ensuring that the prompt you have available to you in Linux is also short. I have a short machine name and a short username to give me as much prompt space for my commands. It's a small thing, but it's a style that I prefer. It is, of course, not required. Nice short name for my machine, Deb, and continue. You can leave this blank. We identify everything in my classes using IP addresses and not machine names. So you can leave this blank. You can type whatever you want for the network. I typically use opsys.bit just by tradition when I've explained that in class, and continue. Now it wants passwords. Choose a password that you can remember in class. And we've talked about passwords and password strength and password security, but I want you to keep in mind that this is a closed ecosystem. This is an academic exercise inside of your laptop that is pretty much protected from any external influences. So all of those important things about password security and password strength and password uniqueness and not reusing your passwords, yeah, I should probably emphasize those in our classes together. However, this is an academic exercise, and struggling with passwords just so you can learn something seems counterintuitive to me. So when it comes to these kinds of things, I use very generic passwords. I'm even going to use something even more generic here, just to keep it pretty straightforward and easy to use. Okay? And continue. You need to create a new user in the system. You can type in your full name, but I never do, because again, it doesn't matter. These are filling out a couple of fields in the etc or the etc password file, which have no bearing on how the system operates. So we're just going to use the user ID that we are going to set up in the next slide. And again, I tend to keep these short, 4 characters, so that my prompt is nice and small. So SJ is fine, and again you want a password. That is nice and easy for you to remember. Okay. Here in Winnipeg, we are in the Canadian Central Time Zone. Next thing we are going to do is set up our file system. Again, in a production environment, you would do this differently, keeping in mind having separate partitions for different kinds of functionality. That way, if one of those partitions fills up, you can add a separate partition that is larger without really impacting anything. Also, if a partition fills up, it does not collapse the entire operating system. If your home directory or your variables directory, your var directory, the directory that can grow in size unexpectedly where we have databases and web servers running, if that grows unexpectedly and it fills up, it doesn't collapse your whole file system on you. Again, as this is an academic exercise, I'm not going to worry about that. I am just going to use the defaults when it comes to setting up the partitions for my instance of Debian. Default, 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 and on this screen you have to say yes and then continue. Okay? We do have to say yes on this because the installer thinks it's about to change your hard drive. You're not. You're changing the file that represents the hard drive in this virtual machine. But the installer doesn't know that yet. It doesn't know that it's in a virtualized environment. So it's saying, I'm going to change your hard disk. Are you sure? So because of that potential risk, you have to select yes and continue. It will set up the partitions and format the file system with the extended for file system, and it will start pulling content off the optical media and write it to the hard disk. If it ever looks like things have stalled, you can always take a look at the status bar of your VM window and you will see different activities. Red for writes, green for reads. So as it reads from the optical media, you should see flashes of green. As it writes to the hard drive, you will see flashes of red. And if it reads from these as well. Same with the network. And you can also check the processor to see what kind of activity is happening as well. USB will give some activity as we move our mouse because of course our mouse is USB based.
A little later.
It has finished installing the initial content of the optical media at this point, and now it wants to go on to the next step, which is installing anything else. It's confirming that you're not doing this in an air-gapped environment or what have you. It's not asking you, it's asking you if you have any other installed media. It assumes that you don't, and you want to install off the internet. So this case, again, the default is fine. No, we don't have other installation media. We are going to install from one of the servers online. So no is fine, continue, and now it says, well, where do you want to find these install servers? Canada, for those of us in Canada, is fine. And I would use the deb.debian.org mirror. You can use some of these other ones. Just be careful because you're going to generate a lot of traffic to some of these academic institutions which may or may not be fair. They may have these set up for their own students. The deb.debian.org seems to be the one that we use with very few problems. So continue. If you are in an environment where you need to configure a proxy, you can set that now, otherwise I wouldn't worry about it. Continue. what's happening now is it's going out to the internet and it's getting the necessary components. You can see activity again on your status bar showing that it's reading content from the internet and it's getting ready to set up the list of software that we are going to install next.
Later.
Okay. This package is one of the first things it wants to confirm. I usually say no to this because what this package does is it monitors the software you install and reports that back to Debian. And I mean, there's a couple of reasons we don't. First off, the underlying risk analysis. Do not install anything that is unnecessary. So that alone would disqualify it. But there's another reason as well. The way that we use Debian in these classes is not a typical use case. And I don't think we should be skewing the results of their survey with the activities that we do in our information security program. So genuinely, I encourage students to say no to installing the popularity contest package. The next thing we are going to do is select exactly what we will be installing. And as I said before, only install what you need. The standard utilities, yeah, we need those. We do need SSH, so we want the bottom two selected. I want everything else clear. Clear all other checkboxes, clear all other checkboxes except SSH and standard system utilities. Those are the only two packages for all of my classes that I would like you to select. Please ensure that is the case and then click on continue. And at that point you will see content downloaded from the internet and written to the hard drive. Depending on your connection, it will take as long as it takes.
Many unbearable hours later.
Now, as I'm sure I've mentioned in all of our classes, there are three things you need to boot into an operating system in the PC world. You need a BIOS, which is in this case managed by the virtualized environment. In VirtualBox, there is a BIOS for the virtual machines, so that's covered. You need an operating system. Well, we just installed that. We just installed the Linux kernel. That's going to give us the operating system that we need. The third component you need is a bridge between the two in the PC world. And in this case, that is called the bootloader. The BIOS calls the bootloader calls the operating system kernel with any necessary parameters. It is a requirement for the PC world. When you boot Windows, it launches the Windows bootloader so that it can load Windows. If you've ever hit F8 as Windows is popping up and it's presented you with that menu of boot options, you are in the Windows bootloader. In the Linux world, probably the most common, and don't quote me on that, but I seem to see it everywhere. One very popular, if not the most popular, I should say, bootloader is the Grub bootloader. And we need this in our virtual machine. So it says, do you want to install Grub? The answer is yes, and continue. Now again, it's going to be changing the hard drive. It thinks it's going to overwrite the existing bootloader in your hard drive. It's not. It's changing a little bit of the file that represents the hard drive in your virtual machine. So we don't have to worry about any changes to our Windows setup. So we're going to select the hard drive that we installed to. And again, it's the default. It's either enter the device manually or the other thing. I shouldn't say the default, the other option on this screen. Select that and continue. And at that point, it will set up your Grub bootloader. Once it's done that, it's going to go through and do a little bit of final configuration and cleanup. And again, if If you're worried that nothing is happening, take a look at your status bar. You can say hard drive read-write activity. You may or may not see internet activity. You definitely see that the CPU is running and active. So if it looks like it's frozen, always check your status bar and make sure. Okay. Now it's saying make sure that you remove the optical media, but if we take a look at our settings, the optical media has already been removed, so we don't have to worry about that. We can click on continue, and it will, as I said, clean up the system and reboot your virtual machine. This is Grub now. Instead of giving us 30 seconds, we really only have 5 seconds before it launches the installation of Debian. And that's it. You have successfully installed what you need for Debian. Now at this point you can, or you may be inclined to just click on the close button like that. I'm going to ask you not to do that with this or any virtual machine as much as possible. Now sometimes you just have to do a hard reboot or a hard shutdown, but as much as possible I would like you to elegantly shut down these virtual machines. And we do that with machine ACPI shutdown. That should always be the first thing you try. In Kali, in Remnux, and some of the other graphical Linuxes that we use, there is a little power down option. Of course, I encourage you to use that. But we don't have a power down option in our terminal only environment as presented. So what we would do is machine ACPI shutdown. And when we do that, it will send a signal to Linux saying you need to shut down now. It's actually born from UPS, or uninterruptible power supplies, that are used in server rooms and then sometimes workstations as well. But basically it's a signal from the battery backup system saying, hey, we're about to run out of battery backup power, you better shut down now. And if the machine's operating system is configured to recognize and respond to that signal, it will elegantly shut down. Anyway, that's it. That should give you the basics of what you need for Debian for all of my information security classes at RRC Polytechnic. As always, if you have any questions, please let your instructor know. Have a good day. Bye-bye.